So welcome to Utopia 513. Utopian societies, Sara Horowitz writes in her book, Mutualism, are America's most successful experiments in mutualist economics. And they date back to the same time period as Tocqueville's associations. These utopias, Sara writes, all had one thing in common that the history books largely ignored: a damn good scalable business model. And she's referring here, of course, to the different utopian societies, the Shakers, the American Utopians, and all the other organizations from the 18th and early 19th centuries. Those and other experiments in utopianism set the stage for today a new and robust form of mutualism and cooperation. They form part of what we call today a solidarity economy. And in his article on Future Horizons, Esteban Kelly charts a vision for a solidarity economy, which, he writes, in which all people have access to ownership and control of the institutions that sustain us: work, land, home, care, education. But Esteban does write, quote, "This is not a utopian vision. It's not an alternative. It is possible and it is necessary." So you might be asking yourself, why are we here in Utopia 1313 if it's not a utopian vision? I think the answer turns on a few distinctions. One between a notion of utopianism in a somewhat derogatory sense that was in part crafted by Marx and others who were writing against the utopians in the 19th century. A difference between that idea of kind of utopianism as something that is unavailable, and of course the concrete utopias that we're exploring this year. I think it also, and in this session in particular, turns on a distinction between theory and practice, between imagining and doing. In this session, we're going to be moving inductively from the doing to the imagining in a way. We're going to be moving from practices of concrete utopias to theories of mutualism and cooperation. In the introductory post, I was referring to this as the relationship between theory and praxis. I was referring to it as a double helix in an infinite Mobius loop. I don't know if you guys could visualize this, but so it's this idea I had, which I couldn't write the words to it, but I felt it's kind of like it's the double helix in the sense that it's completely intertwined. So theory and practice are intertwined necessarily, but it works in a Mobius strip in the sense that the theory strand loops into the praxis strand, right? And then the praxis strand loops into the theory strand, right? So do you get it's like really, well, we can try and figure out if it makes any sense. But that's the idea. And we're going to turn the Mobius strip this time towards how practices of cooperatives and mutuals can inform the theory of mutualism and cooperation. Of course, there's no one better to do that than two brilliant mutualists and brilliant critical thinkers who've done just that, Sara Horowitz and Esteban Kelly. So let me quickly introduce them to you, and then let me turn the floor over to them to start our conversation. Sara Horowitz founded a nonprofit in 1995 called Working Today, which eventually grew into the Freelancers Union, headquartered here in New York City, with the work of some others, Leila Ral, who's here with us, and others. And the Freelancers Union provides support and resources and benefits, including insurance for freelance workers. And we'll talk a lot about that. Building on that experience, Sara's continued to organize other forms of mutual support, founded another insurance startup, for independent workers, and has also developed a theory of mutualism that she spells out in her book, Mutualism, Building the Next Economy for the Ground Up, published in 2021. Sara is a practicing mutualist and the daughter of a labor lawyer and the granddaughter of a former vice president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She's a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award and of the Eugene V. Debs Award for pioneering work supporting the needs of part-time, independent, and freelance workers. Welcome, Sara. We are also blessed to be joined by Esteban Kelly, who is a founding board member of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, and who is also the executive director of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. Esteban has been kind of at the heart of the cooperative movement in this country for years now. He also co-founded and is a worker owner of AORTA, Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, which is a worker co-op that builds capacity for social justice movements and projects through intersectional training, consulting, and facilitation. Building on those foundational practices, Esteban Kelly also writes, and he spells out his vision for a democratic solidarity economy in different writings, including some that we've had for today's session, Future Horizons, Visions Towards Democratizing Our Economy. Academy as well would be a good idea. He's served on numerous boards on all of the organizations that are at the heart of kind of cooperatives in America today, the Democracy at Work Institute, the U.S. Solidarity, well, we talked about that one, the National Cooperative Business Association, CLUSA International, the LCA Land Trust, the International Federation of Worker Cooperatives. So really at the hub of all of the work that's going on with worker and other cooperatives. And he's also a recipient of the Philadelphia Social Innovation Award for Public Policy. So welcome, Esteban. We have a lot to talk about, some of which has been set out in some of the introductory posts, relationships to capital and capitalism, the term itself, mutualism, I think we want to talk about, the relationship to race and racism in America and racial capitalism in America, questions of financing. But before we jump into all of that, I want to give you both an opportunity to say a few words and open up. We are deeply grateful that you're here with us and look forward to the conversation. So thank you very much to both of you. Sara, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. First of all, hello, everybody. Nice to see everyone. I was going to start by saying I was actually, I was kind of raised as a mutualist. I would say that I grew up in these institutions that were founded by generations of workers. My grandfather was a vice president of the ILGWU, but that union built worker housing that my grandmother lived in until she was 96. So it was like neither quaint nor charming or cute. It was a place that garment workers could live out their lives affordably. And I would go to her house or her apartment pretty much every Sunday and eat the food that really wasn't that good, but that's another story. So, but I think what's really important about what we're talking about here is that these are some heady ideas, but the manifestations are actually quite concrete and very tangible. And mutualism tends to be about the things that human beings not just care about, but need: food, shelter, aid to loneliness and anxiety, housing. I think that when I look at people here, I see Dr. Shani Peer, who has been a great mutualist herself, and Dr. Leila Voral, who her PhD thesis, actually is one of the only things that has been written about a lot of the work of Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, and I relied on it on my book. So I want to talk a little bit about, very quickly, the best mutualists in the United States, I think. Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, who started the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, A. Philip Randolph in particular. He had a very strong opinion that the Union of Black Craft Workers needed to stay in the AFL, which was controversial. We could have a whole conversation about that. But the truth is he integrated the AFL. And not only did he integrate the AFL, but while he and Bayard Rustin were at it, they integrated the military and were the major and significant architects of the March on Washington. Sidney Hillman, who Layla wrote about, to me is the foundation for so much of the safety net that we take for granted now. The Clothing Workers Union actually started remittances for immigrants that immigrants use today, started by the union. Affordable housing, well, that started with Sidney Hillman and labor housing. Banks started by Amalgamated, but we don't tell that story, which is another story. But what is mutualism? We're here now. We've been talking for a few minutes, and it really rests on three principles. The first is a solidaristic community. That can be a union, a cooperative, it could be a knitting circle, it could be a psychedelic association. It's the solidarity, and it's boundaried by that solidarity. The second principle is it has an economic mechanism, but that can be dues or services, but it could also be a time bank. It can be time, but it has to be an exchange where people are in this together, exchanging as equals. And the third is a long-term time horizon, because we human beings have one lifetime, but institutions can pass wisdom from generation to generation. What's so interesting is that these four sectors typically are unions, cooperatives, mutual aid networks, and the organizations of faith communities, education, hospitals. It's about over $1 trillion of our economy. So why do we know so little about it? Why doesn't feel so present? And I think that's a question, but I think it's also because it's hiding in plain sight. It's all around us. I want to talk to you now about three moments in mutualist history, which I think kind of answers why we don't know so much about it. If you think about our economy and our society, you can think of it as three lanes, which you just heard about last week, so forgive. So the first lane is a private, for-profit, corporate lane. The second is government. And I would say the third is the mutualist lane. So the first moment to me that's very significant of mutualist history starts with Franklin Delano Roosevelt enshrining the right to unionize. A government may not form a union. The Soviet Union had government unions. In America, government may not form a union. In America, the for-profit sector may not form a union. That's called a company union, and it's illegal. So what he did is he said there are three lanes, though he didn't say that, but he meant that. It's important that the mutualists have their lane. And that is a very important theme that I think we forget. So the second important moment in mutualist history is 1984, which we think of as George Orwell, but I would say it's Ronald Reagan. And in 1984, he demutualized all the mutuals, the banks, for the most part. He privatized and allowed private equity to come in. So why do we care? Well, because what we did is we destroyed the economic engine that provided capital to the mutualist sector. And if you don't provide capital, you then rely on private sector, which has requirements of return that don't center on communities. And it worked. The third moment, I would argue, is quantitative easing. How many people know about quantitative easing, just conceptually? Yeah, so basically the Federal Reserve after the financial crisis, and I was on the board of the Fed at the time, not during the financial crisis, but when they were buying those. Yeah, it's totally all my fault, I wish. Then I could do something with that money. So what happened is the bank started to buy the assets of all those banks that were failing. And it was considered a, quote, bad investment, right? Because the banks were failing. But it's a central bank It's a mutualist entity. It has a long-term time horizon, so they could wait. And it turns out why those assets are mighty profitable. And right now, the balance sheet of the Fed is just under $9 trillion. So here we were, we collectively, the American public, bought the assets of the banks. The Fed's money goes right to Treasury, as it should, no discretion, right over to Treasury. Treasury takes the money, sends it to Congress. And what did you get for that money? Did we get a giant capital pool to start to fund the opioid crisis? Did we fund light rail? Did we start to address climate change when we had trillions of dollars? We didn't. But we didn't even know that there was a mutualist lane. We didn't even see that there was a mutualist lane. And we didn't even think there should be a mutualist lane. But if we had magically been ready at that moment, we could have said, wait a minute, all those people who destroyed the banking industry and didn't go to jail and didn't pay a penalty and instead got bonuses, when we actually had money, we didn't even have an ask. So we didn't even conceptualize that. And that, I think, is the third moment of mutualist history. So the task now is to reclaim our lane, to start to understand what is our lane and what we need to do. And the most important thing to me maybe is surprising, which is we have to change our culture. And at this moment, whether I think we like it or we don't like it, we have to evolve to a culture of building. We have to start to be building the institutions and the things that we need, because if we don't do it, nobody will. And so what I've started to do with others like Esteban is form the Mutualist Society to start to bring together mutualists, to start to say, we need to start finding who's doing what, a little bit like the Mont Pelerin Society, but that's another story. Let's start exchanging our networks. Let's start to understand so that we can trade best practices and information. Let's start to have an ask so that when we have another Build Back Better, we can start to think about what are the things that we're going to need? What are the new capital pools? What will be the changes in regulation and law? How are we going to redefine the mutualist lane so that it can thrive? And so eager to talk much more about that, but hope that you can start to think about the 3 principles of mutualism and see that it's really everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's really helpful to sketch out the big picture. And I think we're gonna pick up on those questions, particularly on this idea of what it is to, what is the idea, what is there to build at a kind of a collective level or national or international level. But before we do that, let's hear from Esteban first, and welcome.
Sure, thank you. And I also want to extend my appreciation for being part of this. I'm really interested in the framework that you're exploring here and digging into dialogue about this alongside Sarah. So yeah, my name is Esteban, and you might have gotten a sense from my little intro over there, but I often stick out in these spaces. So on the really practitioner heavy solidarity economy space, I stick out as the guy who dropped out of my PhD program and is kind of a very big picture visionary conceptual person and vibes more with movement culture. And then when I am in the more exploratory and conceptual and visualizing spaces, I stick out as somebody who's very connected to very practical and pragmatic, like what are we building? What is that? How I often am the voice of impatience around how disconnected some of the very theoretical things can be from like my people who I feel like we're on the ground, we're doing the thing. And so a lot of my work is around bridging those worlds, and I find that to be a really productive tension to explore. So I want to say a couple of things about how about how I explore that, just to frame some of the conversation we can have. And maybe that's in some way an extension of my introduction. So I think another way of describing the impatience that I feel sometimes in some of the sloganeering movement spaces. Some of you probably are old enough to remember the movements around probably about 20 years ago that were organizing under maybe like the first Bush administration, this slogan and this idea that another world is possible. Some of this actually started under the Clinton administration with the sort of pushback against corporate globalization. And it just always bothered me. I was like, is this what we're insisting on, even the mere possibility that like we can build a different world? I'm like, don't we all already know this? And how limiting is that kind of framework? And so I think there's something really productive that can happen when you take that as an a priori assumption, as opposed to the vision that you're trying to rally people behind. And to move from a place of just cheerleading the mere possibility of another world into like, how are we actually building this? And that's a lot of where my work comes in. I just in the last year or two got involved at the University of Illinois in Chicago. They have this social justice initiative, and within it, there's a fellowship program that I'm doing with people who similarly stick out in their spaces. So probably about half, maybe even a slight majority of my fellows, there's a couple dozen of us, are in academia. They're either graduate students or postdocs or they're professors in tenure track positions, and they really are offering a lot of intellectual thought and applied research into a few different questions, which I'll frame up in just a moment. The other half of us are people like me who maybe are more comfortable engaging in theory, using theory, but really are people who are organizing and building organizations and projects directly. You know, people who organize with domestic workers, with the Democratic Socialists, with the Movement for Black Lives, who organize people who are incarcerated, and people doing climate justice. Like one of the founders of Sunrise Movement is in this fellowship with me. So it's really humbling to see like really cool people to be thinking alongside. And in fact, we're being mentored by very esteemed intellectuals who have similarly bridged worlds. People like Naomi Klein and Keeanga-Yamada Taylor and Robin D.G. Kelly and Angela Davis. And so we're sort of like in this space together thinking through these questions. And the project itself is called the Portal Project. And it was inspired by that essay that I'm sure many of you are familiar with by Arundhati Roy that came out in spring of 2020, positing that the pandemic itself could be a portal. Like, what does it look like to have the entire world, all of our cultures, all of our political economies, all of our social relationships grind to a halt, and take that opportunity when we get going again to step into something that actually is different and is new. And it harkens back to some of that sloganeering, right? That another world is possible, right? Like, how do we use the pandemic as a portal? So the Social Justice Portals Project is really looking at these three different spheres. And I think what Barbara Ransby, Dr. Ransby, who's the sort of main force behind this initiative at UIC, the way that she had framed this was, look, I'm trying to find people who are on the front lines or in some sort of leadership doing work around prison abolition as one sphere, around climate justice as another sphere, and around racial capitalism and economic democracy. And of course, the only way we resolve any of these issues, if you're foregrounding one of them, the only way to actually resolve it is by addressing the other two. And so there's something about this Venn diagram, and I literally have a Venn diagram here as if I'm still presenting on Zoom and I'm gonna like click through slides or something. So it's this Venn diagram, like we actually have an understanding, a theoretical understanding of how these things are of mutual benefit for our liberation, for getting through this pandemic, stepping through the portal, building new worlds. And so I think that has a lot to do with this idea of exploring utopia and of concrete utopias, even if there's some, I think, healthy antagonism in some of the way that we might approach it in different ways. I myself, I spent a lot of my time maybe more as an undergraduate student activist, and even as a teenager in the environmental justice movement and what eventually became the climate justice movement. I remember going to the COP6 conference in the Netherlands. Like, that's how old I am. Yeah, couldn't imagine getting up to 27 or whatever number we're up to now. But primarily, and over the last 20 years or so, my work has been in the other two spheres. I've done a ton of work on abolition without initially conceptualizing it as abolitionist work. So I was part of a cohort of organizers in the early 2000s that really formed the framework of transformative justice. And so when we talk about a world without police and like, what does it look like to transform our lives in terms of community safety and accountability, and how do we address harm? I did organizing around intimate partner violence and sexual assault through a very community-based transformative justice collective before we had language for that. And yet when they came to me about being involved in this, it was actually through my work around racial capitalism and economic democracy. And so I do have this funny perspective on these Venn diagrams where I'm like, I understand the cultures of these different movements. I understand the history, the social history we're coming from in being overly siloed in our movement strategies, in terms of the nonprofit industrial complex, in terms of public policy and how we think about that work. And so, and I understand what can be helpful, and I'll kind of wrap on this, about really using the future, going sort of maybe even beyond what Arundhati Roy was inviting us to do, using it really almost aggressively and really pragmatically as a tool to draw us forth into our preferred future. And so in addition to this fellowship, I also, beginning of this year, became a fellow with the Institute for the Future, which is based, it's like across the street from Stanford, and it's in Palo Alto. And it spun out of the RAND Corporation. It's a weird history back in the late 60s. But as part of it, those of us who are fellows got to learn some of the methodologies from futurists. Like, what does it look like to actually apply tools and rigor to things beyond just like strategic planning or scenario building, and some of the things that people might be a little more familiar with. And also realize that the only people who are using those tools, or primarily the people using those tools nowadays, are the military, certain governments, not the US government. They think too short term. They're really thinking in electoral cycles. Other than the Pentagon, they're doing some 10-year planning, and even that is fairly short term. When you think about the community of people who really practice foresight and futurism, but really it's corporations. You know, the clients of the Institute for the Future are Nike and Procter & Gamble and Pepsi and groups like that. So thinking about what does it look like to actually apply some of those tools and rigors to anticipate the multiple kinds of futures that are coming forward. And that's really where that article came from, was starting to apply some of those methods to explore where this stuff could go, and then to work backwards. They call it like a future back approach, to work backwards and use foresight to inform the present. What is our read of the present moment, and how does that inspire the actions and choices that we can take, and the kinds of institutions that we're going to need in building that future. So a lot of that for me is, of course, guided by my very day-to-day and practical work, stewarding this business trade association. I mean, it's basically a chamber of commerce for worker-owned cooperative businesses. That's sort of what the Worker Co-op Federation is. And every day I'm working with my members, and I also have my own co-op, Aorta, like Bernard had mentioned, where we're actually practicing on a practical level, you know, what it looks like to collaborate, what it looks like to be liberated from the conventional logics of capital, and to bring that data over into movement spaces who are thinking about, you know, what does worker justice look like? what do harassment-free workplaces look like? What does it look like for workers to actually be in control of capital, to rent out capital, as opposed to always being on the other side of that, and to ground that in the kind of political and social history that Sara writes about so beautifully. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Esteban. And as you were talking, I was thinking, Sara also says, well, welcome home, because you are in a space of, I think, frustration or impatience with the disconnect in part between theory and practice. I think that's why all of us are here. I mean, that's the, in some sense, the motivating drive of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought is a certain sense of impatience in the lack of relationship, or an effort to bridge, as you were saying, to bridge these worlds of both practice on the one hand and critical theory on the other. So that's one thing I was thinking. The other thing I was thinking is such small world. So maybe Shakur and you were like, oh, wait a minute, we met. So of course that I wouldn't remember the Portal Project. Right. It was in that early COVID Portal Project meeting that we first met. Okay. All right. So I've been trying to place you for the whole day. So it finally makes sense. Okay. All right. So here's what I propose. I think that I do think that it would be really useful to build up. I mean, and to build up from the concrete experiences, because in part, I don't think that we can talk abstractly about a mutualist lane, or to figure out what would be needed, or where that, $7 trillion investment could go, unless we have a very kind of concrete understanding of the form of organization that mutualism is. And so I thought we could start. Sara, you could tell us a little bit about the way in which the Freelancers Union developed, technically, also financially. How did it become a sustainable and sustaining organization? And then Esteban, maybe you could tell us, I was going to ask you about the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, but maybe Aorta would be a better place to start, because that is a worker co-op in itself. And so we could start there, and then we could move to the Federation. But Sara, why don't you start by telling us a little bit? And so the point here, of course, is for us to understand exactly how something can be built from the bottom up, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm a little bit nervous to say that I think it's the double helix Mobius structure.
Excellent. I'm going to stick with that metaphor now.
That's what it is. So, I think that when you're trying to build something, I'll just say for myself, but I think for many others, you have to have some kind of picture in your head of what it is, or a really tangible notion of what the problem is. And so I would say I was both holding on analytically to the 1920s labor movement that I learned from going to my grandmother's house, that like, here are these garment workers, they come together, they engage in collective bargaining, the union takes a spigot into the dues money and acts it like its own venture capitalist, and invests and creates its own bank and housing. So I kind of had that in my head. And I started to do what every organizer always does, is you just start talking to people, and freelancers turned out, still is the issue, is health insurance. And so at first I thought, what a disaster, I'm going to have to learn insurance. But what I did is I just started to really learn insurance, like really the boring but interesting stuff. And so it was the very tangible figuring out. And then let me just say this also. I'm sure many of you have freelanced in your life, and freelancers are everywhere, but they're not at the factory gate, and they're not at a university. So you have to have them kind of find you. So for people who know marketing, there's the push strategy, which is like, I'm a bazillion-dollar company and I am spending all this money on ads, and my customers will come to my website, and that is so fantastic. But if you don't have that, you have to do a pull strategy, which is you have something that people want and they're going to find you. Heroin is the perfect example of a pull strategy. You'll go to any city, you'll figure out where the heroin is because you need it. So not quite like heroin, but people needed health insurance. So it was really working up the food chain of understanding what the business model was that would get people to want to come to the organization and to start on a tangible problem that they faced, so that it was kind of working at those levels to get a version 1. Is that too abstract? That's just really true. I can keep going, but I'm
Well,
happy to.
I mean, the more specific question is, so starting a mutualist insurance program requires some kind of financial grounding that is somewhat different, I think, than a worker cooperative. In part because, I mean, we'll move to the worker cooperative in a second, but the worker cooperative is a membership contribution context, where there doesn't have to be big payouts if someone needs insurance. So in the mutualist insurance context, I take it, you need to have some resources. I mean, it's not, I mean, so how did that work in terms of the timing of creating something that would be in place for people to actually draw on if necessary?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm just going to take one short detour and then I'm going to jump into
Okay,
that. So
great.
like the venture capital world has actually solved a lot of this, right? Because they're like individuals who are founders and they have an idea. And so they have a whole vertical market that is set up so that you can find the individuals, and then, you know, most of them will fail, but the ones that go, you'll have like another group of capital, an intermediate level of capital, which will be bigger, and then a lot of those will fail, and then there'll be this small group that gets like a lot of money, right? So they know how to start with just an idea and get you to Airbnb. So like, it's not like we don't know how to do that, we just don't have the money, right? So put that over in bucket 1. Bucket 2, I think it comes down to money. So I got funded by a group called Echoing Green, which paid me money for 2 years that paid for my salary so that I could go around and talk to people and figure that out. And then I started not taking on risk for insurance, which requires huge amounts of money, but just kind of like the 1920s labor people, just trying to get a spigot into a part of insurance activity that paid. And literally, we did a partnership with the National Writers Union. We were paid $6 per member per month. And I like literally would walk around like writing down like we have 300 workers. They're 12 months out of the year, 6 times 12 times 300. That's our budget. Like seriously. And I kind of had a little mantra, which was, thank God we sell health insurance, because the foundation world did not, to me, seem like the place that was about creating worker organizations that had power and control over their own money. So that's really what we did.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, it's creating a collective, which is the freelancers union first, with membership dues, and then working towards creating things like an insurance.
So
Dues,
it's
right.
like an eye toward, it's the 3 principles, right? So the first is you gather your solidaristic community.
Mhm.
You immediately start to think about what is the value proposition that has an economic undergirding.
Mhm.
And then you can think about what structures, et cetera.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, jump in.
On this because
Okay,
I've also
first.
been a founder of too many things, and I'm like, oh no, my brain is exploding with all these, including right now my own freelancer platform cooperative that anyway, that's a whole other story.
That's
Principle 6 though is, so there are 7 cooperative principles that are shared worldwide. For those of you who don't know, cooperatives in aggregate form the largest non-governmental body in the world. So the International Cooperative Alliance, the ICA, represents close to 1 billion workers or members of cooperatives worldwide. A lot of them are farmers or members of mutualistic credit unions, which are cooperative banks. Essentially, they're highly regulated. And between those two alone, that's like most of the cooperators in the world. And then there's consumer co-ops and purchasing co-ops and worker co-ops and other things. And so those are one of the things that governs cooperatives generally is a set of 5 co-op values, things like democracy, solidarity, equity, etc., and 7 cooperative principles, things like one worker, one vote, economic participation. So you actually have to contribute to the thing. But the 6th principle is about cooperation among cooperatives, which sort of seems like, sure, right? That's like your co-ops, so you're just co-op-y with each other. But actually it comes down to this founding piece, because when I think about, for Aorta, when we were founded, it didn't take a lot of capital to get us started, but having technical assistance, having people share their bylaws, just like open source for people who are more familiar with that sort of movement, or who would just donate and volunteer their time to help us along. I mean, we received technical assistance from actually from the Worker Co-op Federation, who paired us up with someone who was a worker owner in an existing co-op. They, I think, received some sort of grant, either from the government or from philanthropy, to do that. This is before I was in leadership there. And that was really helpful. So they just accompanied us and said, well, here's your checklist, here's your roadmap, here's the documents you need from the Secretary of State, here's what kind of like business plan you need to put together. Let's help you do that. Let's look at your budgeting. What is it going to take for you to finally set your incorporation papers and run your first payroll, and how much does everyone need paid, and figuring all of that stuff out. That all comes from Principle 6 ultimately. That idea that it's like each one teach one, or every cooperative helps the other ones in whatever way you can. So actually mapping out your intellectual capital, your social capital, your financial capital, certainly. And when I was involved as a manager in a worker managed consumer owned grocery cooperative in Philadelphia, it was a similar thing. I worked there throughout most of the 2000s. We were expanding from a store that was smaller than this room into a properly, still small, but a proper like actual grocery store. And that whole capital campaign to get that started, there was a worker owned bike shop down the street, and they kicked in a loan of $5,000, and the other food co-ops kicked in money. So all of those origin stories really do come down to these ideas of, what does it look like to lean on each other? Because who's not funding it, to Sarah's point, the government isn't funding it. Capital, as usual, venture capital isn't really funding it. Certainly corporate stuff isn't funding it. Really, philanthropy isn't doing much funding of it either. And often there's a story that they can't. We can't fund anything that's not a C3 organization. We can't fund cooperatives or mutuals or anyone that's going to do any kind of advocacy. Like it's toxic. That's starting to change a little bit. I think that there's been some progress in the last few years, but we have a lot of building to do to create the kind of institutions and infrastructure to start to finance our own movements. Because where this is going, I mean, to your point, when you were saying, Sarah, that we just weren't ready in the financial crisis with an ask. The Worker Co-op Federation had already been around for 4 or 5 years by the time the 2008 financial crisis hit. It's not like none of these books or models were dreamed about or articulated or named. We didn't have power. We didn't have broad enough awareness. And even in that moment, I mean, it wasn't until 2011 with Occupy Wall Street that there became a broader consciousness of like, oh, you mean like workers could just like own their own businesses? And we're like, hello, we're over here. We've been here the whole time. So now I think we're in a much better position for the next crisis and the next crisis to build something bigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so so on the 6th principle of cooperation, cooperatives working with cooperatives, or cooperation among cooperatives, et cetera, there's also this kind of like amplified notion of actually a worker cooperative getting loans the members getting loans from an associated, say, credit union. I mean, at Mondragon, that's the way it works, right? I mean, in other words, so it's kind of like, not only is it a good idea to work together and get information, but also there are ways in which there can be these synergies with also insurance and whatnot, so that they're working together in a way.
Well,
right?
the Emilia Romagna in Northern Italy and Mondragon both have a capital infrastructure that we don't have in America, where they literally kind of pay it forward. So the capital sits on your balance sheet if you need it, but it gets passed. So it actually subsidizes growth of others, and you have to pay in 3% of gross revenues to fund the next era's co-ops, just as the co-op received from the past generation. And we don't have that. And it's really important to know that under the guise of regulation, as if it's all consumer related regulation, it's really designed to prevent these kinds of capital sharing.
Right. Okay. So we're going to leap forward. I think maybe we're going to skip a few steps or something, but to get to this question of what would the ask be? I mean, from what you were both saying, it seems as if the question is the question of capital or of loans, essentially of financial resources. I mean, one question is whether to think about it through the lens of capital or to think of it through the lens of borrowing, right? Of debt, essentially. Because I mean, what's needed, it seems, in order to help jumpstart such organizations is cash, right? Which could be it could be, and in some cases it would be, a government loan, right? In other words, that it could, no, you're shaking your head no. It could be other loans such that people are not thinking through the lens of capital returns, but through some lens of more stable loan return or something like that. We don't need capital, I take it, right?
Of course we do. We need every tool. We need every tool. First of all, who's the we, our whole field? Well, I have members who are running very light on capital, businesses where they're just like showing up with a bucket and a mop and they're cleaning homes. And I've got members that have whole fleets of taxis and gas stations. And I have members who are doing, home care, and a lot of their stuff requires a lot of cash, but a lot of it is like licensing and training to do things like take Medicaid patients and things like that. So it really depends on what we're talking about here. And of course, worker cooperatives, at least in the US, are not concentrated in any one industry, which is a little different from other parts of the world. I mean, Mondragon is heavily industrial, certainly traditionally Emilia Romagna, it's very social services oriented. In Northern Italy, almost no one sends their kid to kindergarten that isn't a worker co-op. They're all there's like tens of thousands of people. And I think it's something like, 20% of their economy in Northern Italy is just directly tied to the social solidarity economy. So that's just a different thing. We need everything right now. Part of the problem is that we don't even have access, and that this is part of what Melissa and I were writing about toward the end of that article, Nonprofit Quarterly. We don't even have access to most of the existing government programs through the Small Business Administration. They actually penalize cooperative business forms and ownership. So anything you're seeing right now is because we are overcoming 10,000 barriers through solidarity and mutualism and a lot of pluck. But really, we don't qualify for the 7A. There's a whole loan program that they offer. And if you're starting a business as a sole proprietor or just with your bestie, you're good. And you can get access to those programs. You can get access to their technical assistance. You show up at the thousands of small business development centers around the country. A lot of them are like a corner of some office at a college campus somewhere, or other government buildings. And they'll have brochures and pamphlets to tell you about, financial projections, tax filing, profit and loss. Those people aren't even trained, let alone They don't even have pamphlets and resources to hand you around how to run a cooperative business, not just for worker co-ops, but even for consumer co-ops. So that whole field of technical assistance that the government funds and finances, it just doesn't exist in this country for cooperatives. We have had to do it ourselves. And so that's when I talk about the barriers that we have to get over. And this, I mean, it is technical ultimately. Like that's like low-hanging fruit of like, let's just get this shit out of here. Like we shouldn't be penalizing it. Then what does it look like to actually incentivize it? So in March 2020, and this was the crisis that we didn't let slip by this time, in March 2020, we were organized and ready this time. So when we saw that the CARES Act was coming down the pike, we at that point we were, I don't know what, like 18 years old or something. So we had access to friends on the Hill. We had lobbyists. We had coalitions.
That was
this was the aid package for COVID, where everyone got stimulus checks, the PPP loans, economic injury and disaster loans, EIDL, all of those programs. And they said, cool, we're going to run this through Small Business Administration. Well, guess what? It doesn't matter whether it's a Republican or Democrat in the White House. The Small Business Administration has all of these clauses that say, oh, and you can't have multiple owners of a business. We just won't. You're not eligible for these programs. We don't care if you're women and minority owned. We don't care if you're part of any of these other incentive programs, green, sustainable, local, economic impact zone. We don't care. You're not eligible. So we had to actually advocate and say, excuse me, there's a major crisis and you need to make an exception to include cooperative businesses. And they said, we'll meet you halfway. We'll allow loans up to a cap of whatever it was, like $200,000 or $250,000. And overnight, that was like an influx of cash into the cooperative economy that we had not seen probably in over 100 years from the government. And along with that, we got in a coalition with the Freelancers Union and other people who were fighting for independent workers, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, et cetera, and said, yeah, also you need to make sure that there's aid, not just through traditional unemployment things, but all your friends, right, who are freelancers, they got unemployment aid as well. That was part of what it looked like to come together as mutualists and actually have a united front in advocating for some of the things that we need. So we need all of those kinds of capital and financing and more. We need people inside of traditional banks to know what the hell they're doing. There's no underwriters who know what they're doing, even if we're not ineligible, even if we're eligible for a loan from Wells Fargo or Bank of America. The underwriters, they look at it and they're like, I don't know how to make this deal work. I don't understand cooperatives. This is too technical for me. And so they just forego it. And then the credit unions who aren't spooked by it are regulated so that they're not allowed to make loans to anything that's like bigger than a car loan or a private mortgage for a single. So there's a lot of stuff in the way. We need access to all of those things. We need some of our own institutions. And we've started developing through our own community development financial institutions, something called non-extractive financing. So this is flipping the whole script of debt-based financing. Groups like the Working World, which is based in New York City now, they have a process that's not based on traditional financing is, hi, here's some money. You're gonna pay me back that plus interest. And if you fail, I'm just going to take all this collateral. So your house, your car, whatever. And that's a lot of why they just don't want to mess with anyone bigger than like one or two joint partners in a business. So what this non-extractive finance model does is they say, okay, we'll build our own pool of capital first. Then we're going to take this risk and invest in your business. Don't worry about paying us back until this business is actually viable and successful and is pulling in some profit. Instead of saying, we don't care what you're doing with your business, you owe us money starting next month, even if you're not profitable yet, they say it might take you 3 years to be profitable, but don't worry about paying us until then. We're going to put everything on the line. And not only that, we're going to be nosy. We want to see all of your books. We're going to hire employees to go in and help you with your sales, to make sure that your books are clean, to help you with your financial projections. We're going to offer wraparound technical assistance because we're actually in bed with you, with your business. And then you pay it back by then becoming part of this financial cooperative where you're then part of the underwriting committee that is reviewing applications and saying like, is that other cooperative in your community? Do they know what they're talking about? Is this going to be a worthwhile investment? And if the business goes up, then it goes up and we just lose the money, but we're not bankrupting the very working people who need the financing in the first place. So
Mhm.
we need actually all of the above.
Yeah. No, well, but I mean, I suppose just point of clarification, I was using a technical definition of capital that was just so related to publicly traded shares, et cetera. So, yes, equity, I mean, a form of equity, yes, clearly. And of course, equipment, et cetera, clearly, right. I was thinking about, I was thinking though about flows of debt versus exchangeable on the market, shareholder equity, which is what I was, the limited sense of capital that I was using. But and so clearly, I hear two big asks, but one is legislative reform, right? So tax reform. So for instance, kind of like favorable treatment of capital gains, right, is privileging forms of economic organization over cooperative organization.
See, I think
right?
that I think that I think the way to really put this is it's a clusterfuck, right? So that
What got the 5 seconds?
This is why the delay. This is why we're not live on air.
right, because the truth is that we have an economy that is designed and set up and regulated because they're the most powerful people who make the rules want to make sure that, number one, that the private sector has the ability to get the capital it needs, that it has its lane, and that the others in the other lanes aren't getting in theirs. So we don't like a lot of government regulation, you hear very frequently, but you also don't want a lot of credit unions coming in and competing with the banks. But like, if you look at mutual insurance companies, the data is really clear. Customer satisfaction is so much higher with a mutual. People get so much more for their money. Like, they just do a better job. So why?
And credit unions are huge in countries like the Netherlands or
Yes.
France. I mean, Crédit Agricole is one of the
United
biggest,
States.
and the United
But I
States, for the
don't think-
federal workers, for instance.
We
But
have
you-
100 million members of credit unions in the United States, and most of them have no idea they're part of a cooperative at all.
But,
Right,
but I
Right.
think.
That's true of
but-
insurance
But
too.
if we.
Yes, also, yeah.
But really, what I think we have to recognize is that nothing changes without people being organized and then having the ability to have power, and no power
Right.
actually ever gets built if you don't change the culture. And if you don't start from a perspective of what Bill Drayton at Ashoka calls everyone a change maker, and that to me is the first step, is that people have to start to have the confidence to know that they don't need to raise money. They don't need to have a celebrity endorsement. They don't need to start with $1 million, and they don't need a foundation grant. And every movement like Occupy or others that starts out, that is what is the seed of the transformation.
Mhm.
Then you have an opinion about what your capital is and your regulation, but I don't think that we should worry, is it like debt or equity, or even some of the particulars, because if the COVID rules like had abracadabra been when there was so much power, they'd be in the room designing what it was, not having to
Yeah.
fight to get into the room.
Right.
But let me just understand something, because when I was talking about government loans before, you were shaking your heads no. You were shaking your head no, Sarah, I think.
Right, because
Because-
government can, I believe that one of the biggest strategies for now is what I would call progressive procurement, right? Government is in the bill, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you still have to spend a lot of government money. And a very small percentage would go a very long way if, let's say, in New York, cabs instead of Uber, we had Access-a-Ride go to cooperatives. If we started after climate disasters, the first 6 months, people always organize into mutual aid. When FEMA comes in, they outsource it to the for-profit sector. We actually already are here. So the government does have a role, but in terms of the formation of these organizations, like I'm with FDR, like they need to be independent of government and they need to be independent of corporations.
But what is that independence? I mean, in other words, does that independence mean that there can be no federal fund or state or federal funds used? Or does it mean that there are, but there aren't strings necessarily attached to the management or something like that? I mean,
They should fund the National Worker Cooperatives and the National Cooperative Business Association and the union movement to then be able to distribute that capital so that there's an intermediary and that you start to have a check on that power so that you're giving people money and saying, you're a grown-up, you know, here are the requirements, we'll check. If you're doing a bad job, you'll get fired. But no, it's not just an individual to government or an individual to corporations. We need to start to conceptualize, you know, Esteban is in a much better position. I would trust your gut on like whether a worker co-op has a greater chance of success or not success. Why do we rest co-ops at the Department of Agriculture? You know, why is it so
well, that's one place.
centralized?
That is one place, though, where there is a lot of government involvement in the agricultural co-op.
It's the only
context,
place in this country. I mean, any other country, they all, you know, Kenya, Argentina, Brazil, they all have a minister of cooperatives. Every one of Spain, you know, there's like it'd be like the secretary of cooperatives. And here we have a deputy secretary underneath the USDA, the Secretary of Agriculture, who's like, oh yeah, we have a program around cooperatives.
Right.
And it's mostly because that's where all of our ag comes from. It comes from dairy cooperatives and like corn cooperatives and like all the cranberries, all of the agriculture in the US is run through cooperatives. Like 80% of what we eat has touched a cooperative at some point on the food chain, right, from the point of production. But I think that there's a different role, and I don't know if this is actually a disagreement or not. But I think that there is a role for the government to play. I think procurement is maybe a smaller one. I think that grants, like these are our tax dollars. The government is giving grants and freebies all over the place to every CEO and executive and Fortune 500 companies, the companies that don't even pay their fucking taxes. So like they should be printing money to support these small businesses. And what's different about that from a small business like family-owned businesses? Well, it actually makes it a little easier to have regulation and oversight because it's not your own private family, right? That there actually are other people involved in it. And we just saw this example of this, you know, all the scandals around the PPP loans and EIDL, like looking at how Shake Shack spent it. If they had not capped cooperatives, if they had run similar programs to actually resource the mutualist economy, what kind of position would we be in? And we know that they have money for it. I mean, how many billions of dollars a week are going to Ukraine right now? Right. While like we don't have health insurance in this country, like it shouldn't even be a question. So when we talk about like, well, what other world is possible? I think there's a world possible where our government works for us and our resourcing, the way that we resource education, not enough, frankly. The way that we resource corporations, the largest ones. Why can't we have federal government, state government, and local government resourcing mutualist businesses? I don't think that should be so, especially in a country that presumes to be like all about for-profit, capitalist, whatever. It shouldn't be so taboo. And in fact, the kind of partnership that we can have even beyond that. So yes, we want access to some of these grants and loans and other things, but in Italy, they went from having way fewer cooperatives than the US to, in their updated constitution, post-World War II, they included in their constitution all these laws about cooperatives, including just let us fund ourselves, just tax us and skim off 4% or whatever it is. I think it might be as high as 4% of the profits of the tax dollars that cooperatives pay to the Italian government, skim 4% of that off, and then feed that into our own cooperative association that supports cooperative education and development and everything else. Mm-hmm. And overnight, they now have all of these people involved in this robust and resilient cooperative economy. I mean, the resilience of them through the financial crisis, the resilience of them through COVID even, it's unparalleled. Similarly in Spain, I think it's a different percentage, but those are the kinds of things that it's actually like a small regulatory change, and it's not even anyone else's money. It's just saying, all right, if REI exists and they pay taxes, have some of that tax dollars, have some of that go directly instead of voluntarily. They could write a check, right? And then write that off of their taxes. We're just saying collect the taxes and then feed it directly into a cooperative organization like
Right,
ours.
right. Okay, so I want to go on the one hand, so I have a question that goes a little bit deep into the weeds and the technical weeds, and then I want to go back up to
Deeper
the-
than we were just talking about tax policy.
No, I know, but
Could not possibly get more deeply. into
well,
weeds.
more deep in the weeds is this. A lot of states in the United States don't have cooperative forms of organization, legal cooperative form of organizations. So in a lot of states, cooperatives form simply as an LLC
Yeah.
or as something like that.
Or they
and-
just incorporate it in a different state.
Or they
The
incorporate it
Delaware
into the state,
strategy.
or they
Yeah.
just use a different device than the cooperative form.
Right.
Is that a way in part to get around the bias against cooperatives in something like the CARES Act, for instance? In other words, since you're not organized as a cooperative, you're just organized as any other enterprise, except it's through your bylaws that you're basically creating the cooperative form.
Right. I
is that
see. I see where you're going. Interesting, but no. That's sort of like nice try. But like once you have all of the like whatever it is, more than like 5 owners, equal owners, that like it's not the fact that you're a cooperative. They don't say you're a cooperative, you're not eligible. They say you have this many owners, you're structured this way, you pay taxes this way. I mean, the only real federal thing, especially for worker cooperatives, and some consumer co-ops, is by filing under this. We are getting more nerdy. Subchapter T, which is like a thing, it's in the tax code. But that's actually where you get the benefits of being a cooperative. It basically you avoid double taxation. So that it's a different thing than what your like identity is, because you filed with the Secretary of State as a cooperative in that particular state. Yeah.
Okay, all right, maybe we're getting too far into the weeds, but let's elevate up then to the more kind of political theoretic issues. I mean, in your piece, there's a mention in the context of racial capitalism about, I think it was in the quote by, oh no, it was in Fred Hampton, in the Fred Hampton quote in your piece, a reference to socialism. And obviously, so here, how do we think about mutualism in relationship to other forms of transformative political visions? Obviously, it sounds as if, anarchism, well, there's a way in which the bottom upness of mutualism or cooperation has a bit of an anarchist feel to it.
Yep.
In the sense that it's people coming together, doing their thing, organizing, but not necessarily within the structures of the state. Although we've already been talking a lot today, and clearly there's an enormous role for the state and regulation, including beneficial, possibly, regulation of the cooperative sector. So how does it relate to questions of anarchism? How does it relate separately to questions of socialism, right? And is it a kind of a political, economic system that is different from those, or can it cohabit within? Can you have a kind of a socialist minded mutualist vision, et cetera? Okay, so you see the different kind of holes that I'm trying to pull us into to distinguish and to come up with maybe something more. Sarah, you want to kick us off, or Esteban?
You should go first. This is your thing.
Well, I think that it's really important to think about scale, right? And how you get there. And once you think about scale, we think about scale like there's this company and there's this product, and it goes across the market where it dominates and everybody uses it. And we all have experienced that in going to any hotel anywhere in America that is like, this is charmless and like, I can't wait to get out of here. because there's a kind of uniformity that results. And it's what I think we're really talking about here is biodiverse scale, which is that you have very local communities that start to organize, but people really, there are patterns that emerge. So you can imagine that it's not like somebody just starts in isolation and finishes in isolation. It's that you start to see who else is there. You could look at the cooperative model, principle 6, and people are helping each other within that network. That network starts getting stitched together. Then there are intermediaries. Suddenly, that's not a small project anymore. It's actually very big within a region or within a state or within a city. So you could say that that's anarchistic to the extent that it's coming from the community itself, the people, the leadership, and then it's stitching itself together. You could then imagine a role of a socialist government in terms of thinking about how you're going to capitalize that. And I think that once you start to imagine how that ecosystem is going to grow from the bottom up, you start to realize that a lot of these isms are really from the last century, and that we're probably going to be picking and choosing, but probably creating something a bit new. And I think that that's where you start to see, particularly in Latin America, some of the interesting token coin projects where people in communities, especially very poor workers, are starting to imagine things and are way ahead of us. And I think that it's a cup of this and a cup of that, but my sense is we're actually on the portal of something that we will understand more as it unfolds.
You're the same person who's on the board of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah.
My first thought is, if you have not read much Kim Stanley Robinson, I could not recommend him more highly. If you're interested in these kinds of questions, he just does an exquisite job of really vividly and using characters and plot and narratives that are fairly compelling, introduces a story about political economy and transforming political economy through the dialectics of revolutionaries who colonized Mars, and like the dialectics of those two planets, the old way of capitalism and all the stuff that's happening here, and people, revolutionaries on a fictionalized Mars mission, who are basically scientists and academics. It's kind of like Antarctica research style people, who end up having these like large political debates, and especially in his second book in the Mars trilogy, Green Mars, they really are like getting into all the nuanced debates about what does this mean? What is our relationship to currency and money and labor? And is your job like your always job? What do we do with the shit jobs? Like, what is what is the polity if we're doing this democracy thing? Like, am I making decisions for people on the other side of this planet? What are the things that cohere us for the atmosphere that they're trying to like create one on Mars overall? And they're like really getting into all this stuff. And then you realize he's really just talking about our own planet and our own future and our own dialectics and our own political tendencies. And he actually introduces frameworks of worker ownerships and sort of calls it the Mondragon model. And that's a theme that he revisits in subsequent novels without really digging into it. He's just like, oh yeah, Mondragon, that's what we do with our political economy. Anyway, he doesn't really explain it. And so that's one place, just to like drop that as a footnote to dig into on your own time if you want. You know, what's interesting about cooperatives is that they're a model, they're a tool for people coming together to meet their economic needs in whatever conditions they find themselves in, autonomously from the government, which is important to name just when you look at some of the 20th century history of how the term cooperatives was used and co-opted under certain communist governments, and it really wasn't. They were like neither socialist nor cooperative, but claimed to be doing both. So generally, that's the first cooperative principle, is that they're autonomous and independent, meaning they're independent of the government. If somebody is forcing you into a cooperative, then it's not a cooperative. It's not a work assignment, and then your own individual membership within it is also voluntary and not assigned. But what's interesting is that cooperatives, generally speaking, can exist within any kind of political economy. And so here we are in the most heightened and catastrophic and spectacular beast of a global economy that's ever existed, and it's chewing up the planet. It's chewing up the forests, it's cooking the coral reefs. Obviously, we're boiling the atmosphere, and we're literally to the point of extinction. Maybe we're not first. We'll probably not be last either, but human beings are part of the apocalypse that's coming, all at the hands of capitalism. And so cooperatives can exist within that. And they were used before that climate crisis was as acute as it is now in the 20th century for people who are really trying to get by. I mean, how are we feeding people at scale? Cooperatives were the solution. How are we housing people? The cooperatives became the solution there. You have things like that big housing projects, cooperatives here in New York City as like case in point. So for all these different kinds of problems, electricity, how are we getting electricity to people's homes for the settler colonial project of homesteading in the United States? Well, 80% of the landmass in the United States is covered by rural electric cooperatives, right? Like, so bringing those utilities to those spaces, that was the solution. So yes, can they coexist? I wrote an article for some piece in the UK or some news outlet in the UK about this a couple of years ago, just sort of parsing, what then is, are co-ops fundamentally capitalist or anti-capitalist, or what's the deal with that? And so I'll send you the link to this, because it actually is just taking that question and saying, actually, they're sort of neutral and they lend themselves better to a socialist economy, which doesn't mean they can't try to fight and coexist within a capitalist one. So I think our prospects, or what it is that we're trying to build, is like, in this book, The Red Deal, that was put out by the Red Nation on Common Notions Press a year or two ago, they put it really starkly. They just say, like, well, we have two choices. It's decolonization or extinction. Like, this, not, why are we talking as if there's all these other options? This is what capitalism is doing. These are its logics. This is what I studied when I was in my grad program with David Harvey down the road at CUNY, really studying capitalism. Like, this is the logic of capitalism. This is what it does. And so weigh down on that, weigh in on that however you want to. But when capital and the oligarchy of corporations controls everything from the news that we consume, shaping public opinion, Noam Chomsky writes about this, right? This idea of manufacturing consent and opinion, and then working the other side, working the halls of lobbyists and all of that. So then, of course, we're faced with pretty stark and dire consequences. So I do think that cooperatives, though, can be really helpful in bridging from this sort of utopian fantasies, especially on the sort of eco-socialist side of thinking about, well, we'll just flip a switch and overnight, yada, yada, abracadabra, Green New Deal, and we can live in this other future. Yeah, along the way, actually, there's a lot of stuff we can do with especially worker-owned cooperatives and other mutualist organizations to transition us. And again, that's one of the things that Kim Stanley Robinson explores in his work.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm still not satisfied because so I mean, the question is whether, well, so the cooperative movement in part got pulled and tugged in these debates throughout the 20th century, in part because of the Cold War. So, I mean, in other words, many of the cooperative, federations actually became somewhat conservative as a result of the Cold War, and changed their rhetoric and made things more palatable for a United States. There was specific messaging, like you can't talk about capitalism this way, but that,
right, the Red Scare.
Yeah, I mean, as a result of that. And now, that still raises the question of whether or not it's possible to be thinking about this through the lens of cohabitation within, kind of like coexistence, as you were suggesting, or whether that's actually, or whether the vision here is of a growing cooperative mutualist sector that actually displaces, right?
Yeah.
That displaces the first
that's the
avenue
project
or whatever.
Yeah.
Whatever. Because, and in part because the problem is that there's always going to be a contestation over what the tax rate is for capital gains versus for, co-op member distributions, right? So where do we end up on this question? Is it a question of just it's a future of exclusive mutualism and cooperation, or is it a future of cohabitation?
What does cohabitation mean? You just mean like coexisting?
Yeah, so you've got a cooperative, you've got a robust cooperative sector within the American capitalist society.
Right. There's still Amazon, but you also have worker cooperatives. Or
Yeah,
something.
a more robust cooperatives. You've got Mondragon now in the United States and other, and large, say, worker cooperatives and other things, but within the current system, the current political economy. Right, so it's a sector where, and so you can choose.
Right.
You can either go,
Right.
You can graduate, you can go work for Google and Amazon, or you can go work for, Mondragon and, I don't know, whatever, right? Okay. Or is this a vision of a political economy that atrophies the private sector and gets eventually and transforms it then into something?
Yeah, I don't see that as either or. I mean, it's a sequential question. Like, at what phase, like when are we casting our, time machine iPhone that we're taking? What are we taking this picture with? It's a snapshot. And if the snapshot is, hey, we're like early in this transitional economy, then sure, it's going to look like you can work at Google, which hopefully we've busted up that monopoly by then, or you can work at the Drivers Co-op, which is a platform co-op that you could use right now. Just in New York City, they're expanding to like a dozen other cities, as a matter of fact. And that's a transitional moment. And then you fast forward much further. I mean, I think in 200 years, there's no question that we're living in the latter, or whatever it was, the former, the one that's like, it's all mutualism because we have chewed away at capital, and that everyone understands why. I mean, they're living under why. I mean, we have to cooperate.
Okay.
There's no other way out of this. And I think the other thing that's important to note, that alongside the Cold War and the Red Scare and all of the roles of the state along with that, is white supremacy itself, that cooperatives were attacked. They didn't just like shrink back. They were actually sabotaged and attacked by the Ku Klux Klan, by white supremacists, and dismantled, especially in communities of color in the US. Jessica Gordon-Emher writes a great kind of historiography of this. She's an economist by training, but I think there's a link to it in that piece that Francisco wrote that talks about this, that like, we actually, it's not that we're like on this progressive, we're just building. We actually are recovering and reclaiming the strength of what we had. I mean, this is like, we're returning to stuff that Du Bois was on the cutting edge of. And if you say the same shit now, you're like a futurist. You're like that, you're cutting edge now. So taking those things in, I think it's just important to understand like, what is the context we're coming from in building this transitional economy. But I think that we don't have any other option.
I mean, I think that when we look at capitalism, especially after World War II, we started to have assumptions of growth that were wild.
Right.
And
Yes.
that growth was an assumption. And even now, when you listen to the news about the growth numbers in connection to potential recessions, we say we just weren't growing that much this last whatever, and isn't that bad? But actually, I think we are using these assumptions of post-World War II to make that the norm, when in fact we can't keep growing, and that is just the truth. And I think that is going to really be the transformative pivot. And I think when you look at regenerative economics and other kinds of strategies, and you look at mycelium structures that enable people to start to build and to share, that really is going to become the next structure. And it isn't going to be like in 200 years, it's like here. And that, I think, is what it's funny for us to be saying, will you work at Google or not work at Google? You know, the truth is that people organize because they're faced with tremendous problems, food insecurity, lack of housing. And if we use the same tools that we've been using for the last 50 years, we're not going to be solving those problems. It's just the truth. And that, I think, is where, that's where we have to start to organize ourselves now. We can't be asking for permission. We can't be asking for government and foundation grants and these other things. That the mobilization comes first and those things follow.
But I take it that, I mean, one of the projects you're working on, the Trupo, is private, is in some way. Oh, it doesn't exist anymore?
No.
So why doesn't it then? Or I mean,
Yeah.
what was that experience and why have you put that away?
Yeah. So after the freelancers union, we had built a big insurance company. There was $100 million company that was wholly owned by the freelancers union. It set up its own medical practice. And after the ACA, it just, the actuarial rules were changed and the freelancers union couldn't raise the $35 to $55 million because there is no $35 to $55 million nonprofit money. So we had built up this incredible organization. So we said, let's see if we could set it up as a startup and do that. But what happened is, it's too long a story for this whole group, but suffice it to say, the success, there just wasn't the time. So venture capitalists really want to see a kind of growth really fast. So we just said, there's just no way that we would be able to achieve our social goals and do these things. And so then we stopped doing that. And then also COVID started. So it was a very important lesson about what will happen when you take a social enterprise that is already successful. It has to end for not very good reasons. And then you can't have a for-profit model. And it was a very important thing to see. And I think that was really helpful in letting me understand mutualism, but not like as a big idea, as an organizing principle. And so that's how what we've done now is starting to bring together the network of mutualists, because you can start to understand it by those principles. And that enables a lot more of a connection between networks.
I have
Okay.
a question for you,
Yeah.
based on the previous thing that Sarah was saying. Because if I dial the time of like the problem of where our assumptions of growth are coming from and the sort of historical particularity of the post-war period, I dial that back to 1492, right? I do think that we actually are looking at a 500-year entrenchment of assumptions of growth based on settler colonialism and all of the rest of it, occupation and extraction and then the Industrial Revolution and enclosure and all of that. And so to me, it seems like we're at some midpoint, if the change is starting now, between the last 500 years and the next one. And I do think it is going to take 500 years to like rebalance this shit. And so I'm wondering how you think about time within all of this. Like, are we in the midst of a millennia long, like epic story of what the last 500 years have been and the next, or how do you think about the time horizon of utopia within all this?
Well, I mean, frankly, I think that the time, our understanding of time has dramatically shifted because of global climate change in a way that was not kind of factored into or did not shape the way we thought about history and the future as well. So so I think we're on a much shorter fuse than we ever were before. And that transformation is, for better or worse, going to be happening at a much faster clip because of extraordinary transformations of our environment.
Which transformations are fast? What do you mean by that?
Well, I
Like
mean,
the economic ones we're talking about? Or
well, I mean, it depends on, it depends on whether or not we can slow down global climate change.
Right.
If we are unable to, I think they're going to be kind of pressure, they're going to be geopolitical pressures that are going to make a lot of our imagining very difficult.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't think that's where you're going to land, because actually the previous question you were asking about the systems, a lot of my imagination is informed. And again, I am an optimist, but I don't always, I'm not limited when I explore the future to my optimism. I'm like, we have to explore the pessimism and all the things in between. I think about ecofascism a lot. I mean, I really do. I think even if we stopped everything now, right? Like, have you seen those graphs? Half of the emissions that have the carbon emissions that have ever been emitted have been like since I was at COP6 into the year 2000. Like 50% of them were since that conference, right? Because we have been emitting at an accelerating rate, because that's what capitalism does. And that the climate changes that we're currently experiencing, the wildfires in Australia, the boiled oceans in the Pacific Northwest, all of that stuff is only from what had already been emitted in the last century. We won't yet experience this century's impact for another 20 years. And so like, it's already going to get twice as bad already, whatever that means. And of course, all the climate scientists are like, there is no such thing as twice as bad. It actually is like chaotic and way worse than you can possibly imagine. And so I think that everything, I mean, it's too clean. Oh yeah, we're going to have this like eco-socialist future. No, there's going to be like fascists who are like, keep the refugees out of our country. I will promise you that you can cling to the kind of safety and comfort of, right? I mean, we just saw this with Trumpism, like make America great again, et cetera. Like, I will promise you that you can still have your like food security and your air conditioning and whatever that is. And we're just going to do the ecological version of this, right? It's Fortress Europe. We're not letting these boats of migrants in across the Mediterranean. And we're gonna, cut our carbon emissions, yada, yada. We're gonna have all these like high-speed rails, but we're not letting any of the dark people in to this Fortress Europe, right? So I think ecofascism is part of what we need to reckon with. And I think what's interesting is that having that be blended with everything Sarah's saying, because I think both of those things are happening, right? It's why I framed the article that way, and talked about it in that little clip for those of you who didn't get to the reading, because I know that life. There's a little soundbite, there's a little clip of like 3 minutes of me just like reading this nugget of like what this approach was to play with these 4 different futures of what's plausible, what's sort of transformational, what's really pessimistic, what are some status quo things, and what's coming is a blend of all of those things. That there's going to be elements, in other words, of things that would have been our most wildest optimistic future. I mean, look at what just happened with labor unions in the last 15 months. Like that's the kind of thing that you couldn't have other than with a rose-colored glass envisioned even 2 years ago.
Yeah. I think that what I've really noticed in talking to mutualists in I was going to say in person, but not necessarily. But when you talk to mutualists of almost any stripe, the thing they have is a sense of obligation and faith. So it's not necessarily the pessimistic or the optimistic or whatever that is. It's the obligation that we have as human beings to act right now for the future generations. And some people like it comes from like a religious faith, and some people it comes from a notion of the divine. And some people it comes from a sense of something greater than themselves. And for some people it's the sense of the love of nature and trees and other things. Like it's not just, some traditional notion. But I think it's really important that we talk about that, because I think that that is the only way that we start to be able to have the strength as human beings to start to take the obligation that we have right? You don't have to succeed at the task at hand, but you may not desist from trying. And I think that is something that we have to hold on to because of everything that you just said, right? It doesn't paint a nice picture. It doesn't say, oh no, Esteban, that's just too depressing. It says, no, that's all true. Like there's so much of that. But I think that is actually in the DNA of mutualism and mutualists. And that's really not in the DNA of a neoliberal perspective. And it's not in the DNA of a highly centralized government orientation. And that I think that's the critical piece.
Okay, I definitely want to open it up to questions and interventions. So you should be getting ready to raise your hand. We're gonna have a mic that's gonna pass around. So while Fonda's getting the mic, just that is in a way, I mean, that final comment really does get at one of the tensions, I think, that is most important here, which is the tension between a more centralized form of political utopia versus the mutualist or cooperative, right? Which of course was well, yeah, but I mean, there's a long history to the conflict, right? Because Marx was a critic of cooperatives because
But it is.
in that.
no,
Yes.
there was a critic of them. He thought they were defective and that they were not the way of the future because they replicated the problems of profit motivation that were of the old.
But he was
of the
also
old
inspired by them, right? Like he was inspired to think about if you have communities that are having this need according to need and want. He saw that as a microcosm that helped him think through his arguments.
Yeah,
So
also-
yeah,
yeah.
you could say he rejected it, but he was highly favorably influenced.
And I also don't think he rejected it. I think he was critical the way that like I'm the biggest critic of cooperatives because I see them up close and I have my own principles. Like I've written some really not favorable stuff about Mondragon in particular, more so than people who aren't that familiar. And they're like, Mondragon's so cool. And I'm like, oh yeah. Cracks my knuckles, writes a 500 page essay about it. So I think that's true. There's a lot to be critical of, and a lot of what Marx was doing was looking at the world around him, a little bit looking at like if this continues or where does this go, like the sci-fi version of Marx, but really being like, well, the cooperatives I see, here's my critique of them, and also here's what's kind of cool about them. And I think what's funny is I did when I was a teenager, I got politicized during that kind of wave in the 90s of anarchism and anarcho-syndicalism in particular, and was reading a lot of the Bakunin and Kropotkin and those types, more so than Marx, and only recently thought to go back and look at like the Wikipedia page on anarcho-syndicalism. And I was like, well, this is funny because even though I just wrote this article saying worker co-ops can exist, maybe not comfortably, but can exist alongside capitalism, and there's no like fundamental critique necessarily. When I went on Wikipedia and just read the definition of anarcho-syndicalism, I was like, oh, this looks like the mission statement of the US Federation of Worker Co-ops. I'm like, this is just what we do. And we don't talk about it as anarcho-syndicalism. And I don't think that my board members think of themselves, well, some of them do think of themselves as anarchists, and that's fine too. But so I do think that there is this is why I keep insisting on this blend, like that, like, why are we insisting on these 20th century battles that it's like anarchism versus socialism or versus the like, whatever the social impact, whatever those B Corp people think they're doing, right? Like that actually we're going to be looking at a blend of these things, at like a diffusion of all of these things. And hopefully the climate crisis is going to force people into a reckoning of realizing like, actually the thing that works is mutualism. And that's what Sarah's saying in a lot of ways, like learning from these rhizomatic kind of networks and mycelium kind of things and bioregionalism, not in like a hippie back to the land way, but in a, yeah, actually, we're not going to innovate our way into some carbon scrubbing thing that's suddenly going to like fix something within a generation. Like, I actually think we are looking at a 500-year horizon of just dealing with how long it takes to get the carbon out of the climate because we just pumped it all there with abandon.
Right. Good. All right, go ahead. Sorry. Please
Thank
introduce
you.
yourself also.
Well, the Catholic Church, a great institution and powerful institution, have always deep antipathy for capitalism. It saw capitalism as a corrupt system. And they also had extreme antipathy for communism because it was against religions, was atheistic. So Leo XIII started this Catholic social doctrine and was a big fan and impulsor of cooperativism. So with all this power, and no question the selfish spirit of many Catholics, they were trying to promote this mutualistic style.
Yeah.
My question is, did it go anywhere?
Well, I think we'd agree that that's called subsidiarity, right? And it's the idea of the economic system done at the most local level, which was done, that was created in relation to communism in, whatever the turn of the last century. I really think that there, and we can not have a whole discussion about the Catholic Church because I'm definitely the last person that would be like entering that discussion for obvious reasons. But I think that the Catholic Church has actually been one of the most important mutualist pillars. Right. And when you look at healthcare and education, it has played a huge role. And when you look at the moral vision of the economy, I can't think of institutions that, other than the labor movement, the cooperative movement, that have played that kind of role. So yes, I think it's hiding in plain sight, but I also think that we've lost the ability to talk about things that we don't agree on. And so right now, there's not the unity on economic issues that there needs to be. And I think we have to start to find ways to agree to disagree about things and to bring these coalitions together, especially since a lot of the working class is Catholic and the working class has to unite. It's the only powerful way that we have coalitions. So I would say, yes, it has done a tremendous amount.
Yeah, and I think that there's a strong, I think about maps and geography a lot in, just because obviously having just spent a little time with me, I'm thinking at large scales in terms of time and space and history and political economy. And so I dallied a little bit in geography on my way to anthropology. And so if you look at the maps of where especially the worker-owned cooperative networks are strongest, the board that I sit on, CICOPA, which is the International Worker Co-op Association, we have sort of country-based membership. So there's like one or two federations in each country, and that's where our members are. It's all Catholic countries. Right. Like who was last? The Canadians in the early 90s, and then the Americans were last because we're Protestant. And when you look at the maps of where 2/3 of the worker-owned cooperatives in Canada are in Quebec alone. And I'm telling you, it is not the most populous province, and economically, it is not the most powerful province in Canada by a long shot. But it is by far the most powerful mutualist density in North America. Really, it's like unparalleled. And you look throughout Latin America, the legacy of liberation theology and of cultures of solidarity and finding a so-called third way. This is like way before Pope Francis, right? That's like throughout the Americas, that's where they're strongest. Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay are really, they're the torchbearers. Other than really Italy and Spain, which literally Italy and Spain, like that's where the Pope lives in Italy, essentially. That those are the strongest, they're the ones who are really laying the foundation and pulling the rest of us up along in building, especially worker ownership and that kind of labor solidarity. And I have been thinking about this a lot, like, well, why is that? what is this culturally, to your argument, that like lends to some predisposition? Is it something about the history of the Catholic Church and liberation theology? I don't know, maybe. I think that a lot of it is around this culture of, what does it look like to just see yourself as belonging to a thing and participating versus a very entrepreneurial, or like Dutch, American, Protestant, like I'm going to be a founder of a thing. I'm going to start your nonprofit and my nonprofit do the same fucking thing in the same neighborhood of Brooklyn, but we're each the founding executive director of whatever the thing is. Like that's a very American thing. I think the way forward is we have a lot to learn from each other. Like that the kind of entrepreneurial thinking and leadership that comes from a very like Anglophone culture is so desperately needed in the countries that have a very strong mutualist. Like we know how to sign up to the thing, belong to the thing, but we're not necessarily like staying up at night thinking about where do we take this? How do we grow it? They're living the Dolce Vita. They're drinking wine at lunch. You go visit Mondragon. It's like it's wine all day long. Like that's their culture.
And the old people are out having.
Yeah, we need to learn how to chill, and they need to learn how to hustle a little more.
Thanks a lot. My name's Scott Solomon. I'm a Columbia mathematics alumnus. It's great having you here because I kind of discovered an idea that I think I'm not smart enough for the idea I discovered. So it's good to have the two of you here. And that is a tax. It's a weird tax design where the taxed only owe 1/3 the tax amount if they pay with a bank loan. And it's a global wealth tax on the 0.7% and corporations and foundations. And the advantage of this design is, the banks would basically be transformed into the global tax collection entity, because they would make on, say, $20 trillion a year in global wealth tax revenues. They would make $2 trillion a year in risk-free loan fees and securitization fees, because they would securitize these loans. And I was wondering how that, so basically, and the banks are one of the most powerful segments of the plutocracy. So basically, instead of using this idea of Marx, like workers of the world unite, where you have to go to this arduous organization of all these workers, you basically, what the plutocracy does is you divide and conquer on the masses, the downtrodden masses. And this idea is basically to use divide and conquer more effectively on the plutocracy, because you get the banks to split off. I mean, nothing comes between a banker and $2 trillion of risk-free revenue. You get the banks to split off from the rest of the plutocracy and just order up this tax. And you were talking about this idea could raise, $50 trillion to deploy toward curtailing carbon emissions and research to clean up. So it's got a climate angle, and it also has what you were talking about, the third track of like government, capital, and then cooperative type things. This tax money could fund not for profits or cooperatives globally, which wouldn't be constrained by this profit. It would just be people could have their own little not-for-profits, and then for-profit enterprises would have to offer them something much better than having that to get involved with them.
Great.
So I would be wondering how that would fit into your this global wealth tax design could augment your approach. Thanks.
Chairwoman.
I just want to say this.
Yeah.
I think what you said offers us an opportunity to dissect and get at the root of something. I actually think that there's huge value in people coming together, because that's how you build democracy, by having the actual experience. So like if you're in a union and you have to represent the other workers at your nursing home, you start to understand how representation works. And if you have to have everybody come together and write an agenda, and if you look at like the Arab Spring, the country that did the best was Tunisia, because it had an independent trade union movement and people actually were ready to know how to move things. Why do I say that to you? Because I think that, like, I love the way you're thinking about how do you do like a jujitsu around capital. And I would say going to the beginning of the double helix Mobius thinking, what you want to do is to start realizing that you're working off of an ecosystem. And so that as you're starting to think of these really interesting ways that you might be able to wedge and change and redistribute, you also have to be working at the other elements, because it's not going to work to just give people things, because nobody grows by just being handed something. People grow when they're grown-ups and they get to experience and learn and teach and make hard decisions. And so I would say, I think I love the way you're thinking. It's really creative, but I would want to look at it three-dimensionally too.
Well, and that last part tees me up for the thing that I wanted to offer, where I feel like I've been remiss in not mentioning participatory budgeting and public banks, which both are, I think, crucial elements for the future of economic democracy, really popularizing these things. You know, I don't think everyone should be in a worker co-op. I actually believe in government workers. I think they should be unionized. And I think in this transition economy, there should continue to be people who are employed by either franchises and large organizations, I'll say, large organizations, and they should all be unionized. And alongside it, I think people are going to need opportunities if they're not experiencing, like in my small worker co-op, everyday democracy, to at least have the version of, you know, PTA meeting, neighborhood planning, whatever, zoning board meetings, to have the opportunity to participate in things like participatory budgeting, and get that flavor and that exercise in agenda setting, in deliberation, in understanding what it means that, like, you don't all get your way, that's what democracy is, and that you actually can be changed and have your perspective or your priorities shift and be moved by being in community with people and seeing how they're thinking, even if it's not in a consensus seeking way on the participatory budgeting side. And then on the public banking side, I mean, these are crucial institutions that are gaining massive momentum now. Like, we are living through this thing that we'll all look back and be like, remember when we didn't know that was all happening? One of the women who's in my fellowship with the Institute of the Future, in my cohort, runs the Public Banking Institute in Los Angeles, and is part of the California Public Banking, whatever they're called, initiative or whatever. They're gaining massive momentum. It's already passed in San Francisco. It's passed in Los Angeles. We have a Philly public bank that our shitty mayor has vetoed it, but it passed city council. So these things are happening, you know, whether that's a place to be deposit holders as individuals, or for pension funds from unions to be depositing the pension. Nobody wants their money in these stupid, you know, polluting, weapon manufacturing, climate dumping, massive banks that are redlining and doing all kinds of other fuckery. Like, nobody wants that. They're unpopular. But what other option do you have? Right? So actually having public banks, having those be the economic instrument. This is why I'm saying we need everything. Yeah, we also need to be able to walk to Wells Fargo and be able to get a loan for worker co-ops. We need to get loans and grants from the government. And we also need public banks, right? That are where the public are the deposit holders, you know, where cities can put their deposits there instead of at Bank of America, and that then those banks have a social mission, have a board where there is some involvement and oversight from the community and accountability from the community, and that those become part of the engine, the economic engine for economic democracy.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elias. Yeah, I'll stand up.
Hi, Elias.
I'm a law student here at Columbia, and I want to go kind of back to the relationship of mutualist organizations and the political economy that they're in, and specifically thinking about a theory of change for the kind of world we want to see. What actually is the posture of different mutualist organizations, and are they all the same? And one idea I want to push is perhaps a lot of these mutualist organizations are in a posture of self-defense against capitalism, neither cohabitation nor a building of something different? And what are the consequences of investing in an infrastructure of self-defense? As an analogy for kind of how I'm thinking about this, it's imagine these leftist defense organizations that we're seeing crop up in the face of violence against minorities and queer people right now. What does it mean to invest in those rather than investing in a future where explosive violence through the use of firearms isn't a reality we're existing in at all? Are cooperatives like investing in the defense organization that nevertheless has to contend with the violence of capitalism as it goes forward?
That's like a portal question, I think, right? I mean, there's a portal answer or something.
Yeah, so this is where it actually is helpful to have practitioners in the room, because otherwise I feel like it's, you know, socialist on Twitter with a cajillion followers or something who's like spouting things that just aren't grounded in the reality of the community. So I appreciate your question, and it's grounding in like, well, how are these organizations thinking, and what really is their culture? Believe it or not, mutualists are just as heterodox as Americans, where they're all over the fucking place. There is no ideological coherence at all. Even lefties, this is a lot of what we talk about in the Portals Project. Like in those Zoom meetings, we're sitting around the room being like, yeah, we pretend like we have like some like left alignment, when like, when's the last time you actually sat down and got brass tacks and rigorous about different tendencies, questions of political, like sophisticated questions about political economy, what sort of role you want different government agencies at different scales to even play, what about international trade, what are we doing with all of those things? And it turns out we're all over the goddamn place. So that's interesting, and an interesting place to organize from. And I think it doesn't preclude part of what you're saying from being correct, which is that there still is there's a shared way that different kinds of segments of the mutualist economy move, either together or against each other. And the contours of that are not what I would have thought from the outside. In other words, cooperatives definitely don't all move together. I mean, I sat on a board, and I will not say what the organization was, but I sat on a board of a cooperative organization. And there was a guy who was straight up a climate change denier. And he was just like, he wasn't like defensively saying like, this is this thing I believe in, all you libs or whatever. Like he just was like, well, I mean, obviously it's like a hoax. And I was just like, what? Like, what? We're like on this board together. There's only like 20 something of us in the room. And like, you're part of that, like climate denying conspiracy, whatever. This was only like 5 or 6 years ago that this guy was there. So like that world, I mean, they're generally very invested in the status quo and racial capitalism as it is, right? In other words, the cooperatives that have managed to thrive, I'm not saying worker cooperatives, I'm saying cooperatives, everything from nationwide insurance to true value hardware to like all the agriculture, whatever. They're generally capitalists. I mean, and especially the kind of people who become the CEOs and the VPs of market, the C-suite leaders within, you know, the board chairs in these cooperatives, they're basically capitalists. That's what they're hired there to be. They're getting these exorbitant salaries. They're right. So those are just to dispel all those myths. We have lines in the sand for the worker-owned cooperatives where we're like, they're our cousins. They're not us. They're not even our siblings. They're just different. The logics of it are different. When your primary stakeholder is a consumer or a deposit holder or a customer or a client, like it's just completely different than being like, no, what matters is like us. We're the ones who work here every day. It's not about membership. It's not about volume or whatever, right? Like that's a very different logic. And yet our other cousins on the other side are, have you heard of ESOPs? Yeah, you guys know what ESOP? All of you are nodding your heads. That's surprising to me. So ESOPs, right? They're employee. There's a program or some sort of component of employee ownership, but there's no control. There's usually no management mechanism. There's no accountability. of the board or the managers to the workers. And so that's like completely different for the other reason. They don't have cooperative values at all. This is not on the table, right? United Airlines was experimenting with ESOP stuff, 20 years ago. And like, believe me, you couldn't be more different than my members. And then you come together to actual worker cooperatives, and that's when things start to get even more heterodox, because it comes back to this anarchist problem where it's just like, well, if you're not cut from the same cloth, if most of the existing worker co-ops, and now I'm speaking mostly about in the Anglophone countries, the UK, Canada, et cetera, that they're mostly startups, right? They're not these like franchises and these things that have spun off or been integrated through a vertical value chain from a successful like Mondragon or Argentina like factory. They tend to have all their own cultures. Some of them are like, oh, we only do work with movement organizations. Some of them are like, we voted for Donald Trump and we're in rural Maine and they're all members of our federation, right? I mean, and those are the minority. We try not to alienate the more sort of conservative groups, and we make it really clear, like our politics are about inclusion, and we are going to endorse platforms that are around creating inclusive workplaces, and making sure that culturally, that whether it's from our class politics, our race politics, certainly our gender politics, that there is solidarity that's happening, that we're actually thinking about oppression and equity, and solidarity from a more sort of liberatory perspective, that we have everything to gain by coming together. And so that's part of why we're not going to alienate you just because you happen to have voted for Trump because you were bamboozled by some propaganda machine. Look, you own a small business, you live in rural Maine, there's a million reasons for understanding why you would have done that. You're still part of this community. What can we do together? So people are all over the place, and I think it's really interesting to go like even further down, because we never know. We'll float trial balloons, and we never really know what ends up being popular.
Do you want to jump in, Sarah?
No, let's hear from you.
Okay, Annabelle.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Not sure. Yeah.
Try again.
Yeah.
What I heard.
No. Make sure the mic is on.
Was there a second one?
Okay, thank you both. I actually came with a lot of questions that I feel like were answered throughout the talk and through Eliza's past question, but I'm also a law student and just had kind of a broad scope question of what you see the role of lawyers is in supporting mutualism generally and cooperatives.
Well, as
If
a lawyer myself, let me say,
Hey.
I really feel like this is like such a practical answer, forgive, but I think we are going to have to be really deeply understanding and translating a bunch of different things at the same time. So it's on the one hand, really understanding what is the zeitgeist and collectivity from a policy perspective, and how is that going to translate into a way to articulate that to regulators or tax policy people, or to go back to the idea of not having an ask during quantitative easing. Well, get that ask. And I know that when I was at the Freelancers Union, one of the most important things was really looking at the arcane insurance regulation and then making arguments, then getting the politics together to get the decision makers to agree. But that needed lawyers. So I actually think that that's really important. And it's not always the big picture, big policy stuff, major litigation. Like I actually think we're going to be really needing to do this translating and being really super creative and dogged. And so, yes, I think that's what
I feel like I could do a parallel career in coaching business and law students about their futures. because we need you guys. There's so many exciting things that you could be doing. The current chair of our board, the president of the Worker Co-op Federation, guy named Ricardo Nunez, he just did that Kim Kardashian thing where he lives in California and got his law degree. He like took the bar exam without going to law school because he's like, Dad, I don't have money for that. But he works as the director of economic democracy for the most exciting organization. They're called the Sustainable Economies Law Center. They're headquartered in Oakland, but they have whatever counselors or whatever you call them, lawyers, legal people all around the country. And they have these like open legal clinics where people can walk in off the street and get advice for running sustainable businesses and just like finding really interesting ways of using the law as a framework and then throwing out all the orthodoxy and the training from all their law professors, sorry if there's any in the room, law professors and like mentors and whatever, and being like, look, the law is just it's just a bunch of Legos. What you construct with it, you can do all kinds of things that aren't just on the box, right? And right now, whether you're in business school, whether you're in law school, everyone is teaching you, here are these Legos and here are the things you can do on the box. And here's step 1, step 2, step 3. Organizations like SELC, the Sustainable Economies Law Center, their website is theselc.org. They're like, no. Okay, what's a different way of thinking of retirement? And they have this like Next Egg project. They do a ton of stuff with cooperatives, not just worker co-ops. They incubated this thing called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, where they're basically trying to solve the housing crisis by creating these land trusts that are, but anyway, they've used the law in really interesting ways. So part of what's happening, I mean, the public banking stuff, we need lawyers who are barred or certified and trained, and then who are going to say, fuck the career trajectory. I'm going to be part of building the economy that we're talking about and that we need. We don't have enough of those lawyers. And even if you can do, I went to college at UC Berkeley, and my old roommate there ended up going to law school at UCLA. And then he called me up, we're still close friends. He was like, hey, I'm working for some like douchey corporate law firm. We did the merger between like Lucasfilms and Disney. He's like, but I can take on pro bono clients. What can I do that's helpful? And I was like, thank God, I just started this like freelance co-op platform. And we need lawyers. We need people who can build contracts for 1099 workers who, right? Like there's all kinds of things that we need from professionals. And that's the #1 bottleneck. When I tell you that for our whole country, we went down from a list of like 12 co-op accountants that we could refer people to and they're not dropping like flies. They're all full. We went from 12 to 6 to 4. I got an email last week that there's like 1. Like we don't have enough accountants for this tsunami of people, Gen Z, millennials, who are interested in these new economic forms. We desperately need more professionals. So yeah, let's be in touch.
Yeah. I mean, another way to think about it is, so our colleague Katerina Pistor here wrote a great book called The Code of Capital or something, The Code of Capital. And it's all about the way in which lawyers code capital. And she goes through it really in a great way, showing kind of like how you privilege capital claims, et cetera. But the point is that you can have a code of there is a code of cooperation, and that actually lawyers are the ones who code that cooperation.
Right. That's right.
So, and it's just as easy, and it's based on exactly the same basic principles of property and contract, et cetera.
That's right.
And so there's a way in which I've been thinking like the curriculum probably doesn't, the curriculum, I mean, all of it can happen within the context of corporation and corporate law, actually, because it's just a corporate form. But obviously, our legal education doesn't sufficiently privilege the ways in which one can code cooperation, right? Predominantly, the legal education focuses on how we we code competition or something. And so,
But that's a great example of everyone a change agent, because
That's
that's
exactly right.
where the
Yeah.
students should be getting together and starting to do that.
Yeah.
First of all, you'd learn a lot, you would teach a lot, and you'd have an amazing professional network when you graduated. And using technology, you'd be keeping up with people so that you could have cohorts. And then you could say, this is so great, we should get together. And then you'd start to think about, is this an association? Are we forming an organization? That's how the National Lawyers Guild got started, right? It didn't get started because they got a grant. Like, these are exactly the ways that people can organize. And I think that's what we should be taking that as a lesson.
Yeah. All right, so let me just frame one last question. Maybe we can use it as a way to wrap up with some final thoughts, okay? And it has something to do with the fact that and many of the questions and a lot of the conversation has been about cleavages or trying to probe cleavages and tensions. And I do have this sense, and I hear it in what you're both suggesting, and I feel it myself. I believe it as well, that there's a way to think about cooperation as not as being in some way a core that, although it doesn't ignore the tensions and the cleavages that historically have plagued forms of cooperatives and mutuals. So questions of, centralization, socialism, anarchy, et cetera, those tensions, that there's a core to cooperation that can avoid most of those cleavages and allow for kind of a path forward. So I kind of heard that a little bit in what you were saying, and maybe some final thoughts on that. Sarah, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I would say that the major tenet of mutualism is don't start by thinking about your enemy, start by starting. And if you may have enemies, then fine. If you have potential conflicts, be resilient. But I actually think it really is a cultural change and a culture of building to start with the idea of that you want to start to think about how to be a lawyer differently, so you can be frustrated because you could go to career services and see that Sullivan and Cromwell's not doing that, right? And neither's White and Case, but you can, and that actually you can, and you can get started. And I think that maybe 20 years ago, maybe people would have felt was like George Bush's 1,000 Points of Light, or voluntarism, or something that felt like you were trying to avoid those conflicts. But I actually think something is very different, and I think it is existential. And I think that we're starting to say, we can't wait. We're already seeing issues, and we can look at faith and start to understand that inquiry actually is about love. And love is what is transformative, and love is what heals, and that we can be about love. And love actually is the economic glue, and it is the base. And that's where I do feel like we have to move away from being a culture of critiquing, because it's not going to work. So yes, but I don't think it's naive. I actually think it's really strategic and smart.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Esteban.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the comment I made earlier about the heterodoxy of belief, and in some ways sort of the antidote to that, and one of our strengths is the coherence of our values and principles. Which, I want to leave you with that reassurance. We're like pretty damn united. And it turns out that like even the heterodoxy, anyone who's done any like door knocking or get out the vote work, and you talk to regular people and they're all over the place. They're like, yay guns, yay gays, no, like they're all over the place on the way that cable news might present you with different issues of like, you're either on this side or on that side, and you have a whole checklist of everything you agree on. But that even those people are just, they're caring. You see this in the aftermath. We talk about this a lot. The aftermath of disasters, climate disasters, superstorms, wildfires, hurricanes, mudslides, all of this stuff, floods, and how people take care of each other. They come together. This whole thing that like, we're all so polarized, we couldn't possibly get along. Like, get the fuck out of here. That's just not true. Like most people are actually caring. They just are like imbibing all kinds of ridiculous propaganda about that's divide and conquer, right? Because guess who that serves? So when it comes down to it, we are bound together through principles of love or solidarity or caring. We care about children. We care about our community, whether that's like an ecological thing for you or a neighborhood thing for you or the coolest bodega or your favorite bagel place, like whatever that is, like those are things that are pretty much unite people. And then when we apply that to, and I think part of the power of the cooperative model is that we have had this coherence of principles and values that were codified almost 200 years ago, and they're enduring. I mean, we debate them, and they have these summits every, couple decades about like, do we add and modify them? Are they enough? But they're all things that like no one really disagrees with. You can get to the fascists who are like, I don't know about this equity piece. Like, I don't know about equality. I'm not really down for that. But for most people, yes. And so having that, that grounding, I think, is part of what gets us away from some of those cleavages and tendencies, and gets us toward alignment and forward momentum. And then I think along the way, we need to apply some sophistication to our agency, like what it looks like to actually deliberate on different questions or opportunities. It does take a muscle that we're fairly unpracticed at, in spite of the fact that we've been told that, at least in the West, we've been living in democracies this whole time. And of course, that's being revealed to be false. Black people have known this for a long time. Indigenous people have known this for a long time. I think it's like newer to a lot of people that actually this hasn't been very democratic, as a matter of fact. And what's up with this electoral college? And by the way, the gerrymandering, right? It's like, oh, right. Now what about you spend, probably, hopefully, not more than 40 hours a week in this other part of your life, and there's no democracy anywhere along that chain. You don't even have democratic options for where you're contributing, you're putting your economic dollars. So I think there's a lot of interest, and we just need to be gearing up and getting ready for many more conversations around what it means to begin integrating economic democracy and meeting the hunger, the interest, the demand for that in the lives of everyday people. And I think being grounded in those values that we share is going to be really important, as well as starting to practice these skills around facilitation, deliberate. I mean, that's why my co-op does that. We specialize in not only facilitating for clients, but doing a lot of train the trainers, popularizing methodologies for how it is that we live in community together. And that gets at that other part of the Venn diagram that we haven't really talked about much at all, which is around abolition and what it looks like to have skill for resolving, working through harm and conflict, even at the level that's as intimate as something like intimate partner violence. That those are all, I think, actually part of, you see how I've gone from like global political economy out 500 years into the future to something as intimate as a relationship, right? That those things actually are connected through the technology, what I call the technology of democracy.
Thank you, Esteban. Thank you, Sara. First, a big round of applause for our speakers. Thank you. A big thanks as well to Shani Pierre for and the Maison Française for hosting us and for helping put this together, to Fonda Shen for organizing everything, to our awesome AV team as well. Thank you so much. And to all of you for coming out this evening. So the program is up for next semester. If you look on the website now, and we'll be getting together with Noam Chomsky and Jay Gossett on January 18th. We've got Concrete Utopias on February 1 with Fred Moten and Kiama Glover, Gary Wilder, Nadia Abu El Haj. We've got sessions on architecture in Utopia with Tony Vidler and others, and Critique Norman Utopia with Shayla Benhabib. So, and Mamadou Diouf and et cetera. So we've got a great schedule for the spring, and we hope to see you then. And between now and then, have a wonderful winter break. All right, take care.
Picture would be my contacts, social media.